Welcome to the Pulsus Research Seminar Series. This is a series where we showcase the best research, both from visitors who come into the school to present their work, but also, in this case, a good example here, of a member of the school, a bit of a research star from our PhD cohort and now teaching with us, Alissa Macoun. It's a wonderful opportunity here, actually, to have a dialogue about a member of the community's work. In this case, we've had visitors from outside for a few weeks. Alissa Macoun, as I said, did her PhD in the department, is now doing research work and teaching in the department. She won the APSA Prize for the best thesis in political science in 2013, which is a pretty big achievement. And her work deals with Indigenous politics and policy, critical race and whiteness studies, settler colonial politics and questions of sovereignty. So we'll hand it over to Alissa, who's going to speak on the topic of solving the Aboriginal problem, Indigenous policy and colonising white innocence. Over to you, Alissa.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the country of the Turrbal and Jagera people, the traditional owners of the lands of Brisbane, where I've done my research by and large. I'd also like to acknowledge the academic and activist communities that have contributed to my thinking on these issues, and that includes, of course, very many people in this room. So thank you very much for inviting me to talk today. It's an honour, and I'm very pleased to have been invited. So this paper that I'm giving today, I thought I'd locate it a little bit before I start talking. I won't spend too much time talking about that. But politically, for me, this comes out of a number of concerns. As a young person, some of my first engagements with Indigenous people and with activism were as a young student at around the time the Bringing Them Home report was handed down. And looking at the first National Sorry Day, some of those waves of white emotion that were going on campus and in other places and in our community, when looking at the removals of Indigenous children from their families and communities and the devastating effects that has had. And then when I came back to do my PhD a decade later, the Northern Territory intervention was announced, and obviously that saw white emotion mobilised behind an authoritarian conservative project in a different way. So I have a long-running interest in this, and one of the things that I'm interested in at the moment is the way that the intervention, which started as a sort of spectacle and as a shock and as an emergency response to a crisis, a national crisis, has become in many ways a new normal. The policy measures that were announced as authoritarian responses to a crisis in law and order continue today under different discourses and with different legitimising descriptions. So part of what I'm trying to do in this project is look at how this happens and why. And academically for me, I'm also working through some issues about my work has started from a place where I've been very concerned about Australian politics and national identity, and come to think about questions of settler colonialism in the context of Indigenous policy. And initially I understood a lot of that through whiteness and critical whiteness. I've been thinking more in the last couple of years, largely through some work that I was very fortunate to do with the National Indigenous Research and Knowledges Network, been engaging with scholarship in critical Indigenous studies internationally and thinking more about race and how race operates in some of these spaces and how race operates in relation to settler colonialism. So this project continues an interest in non-Indigenous investments in Indigenous policy that I looked at in relation to the intervention. And what I'm trying to do here is look at some of those non-Indigenous investments in Indigenous policy in different policy contexts, to see if different colonial technologies, different racialisations and different policy logics in play might see similar processes happening or very different ones. That's probably a little bit opaque at the beginning. I hope that'll become a little bit clearer. I'm right at the beginning of this project, so largely what I've been doing is thinking through the framing approach and the arguments that I'm interested in exploring. It's currently framed very broadly. What I'm looking at is the policy and political logics of these policy and political processes. So what that means is a lot of the analysis is very preliminary, and I hope you'll forgive me for that. What it also means is that this project is very state-focused. It's going to tell you a bit about what non-Indigenous people articulating policy frameworks think they were doing. There's a lot of important stuff that's not going to tell us, obviously, about what those policies mean, how they operate, how they affect Indigenous people, and I can't speak to that, and this paper doesn't really speak to that. So I think the last thing I wanted to say in wordy preamble before getting in with the business of the paper is that one of the things that I am doing is beginning from the premise that there's no bystanders here. All people in Australia, including non-Indigenous people, are always already engaged with and in racialised colonial systems of rule. And we're engaged in what many of us would consider to be problematic political relationships. Some of us get to ignore or deny those facts in ways that others don't necessarily. And there's no politically pure or righteous way to be or think or act that's going to exempt us from this context. And one of the things that I wanted to foreground is that I'm not posing solutions to this in this paper. I'm not offering particular prescriptions to policymakers. I'm not necessarily posing solutions to the violent colonial relationships that continue to form the foundation of our political community. What I am doing is more modest. I'm trying to grapple with the conflicts that we're engaged in, to understand them better, to think about strategies for keeping those conflicts visible in the face of ongoing strategies and attempts to erase, suppress, or even to transcend them. So this is about making and keeping conflict in frame in the face of a whole range of interests that want us not to see those conflicts. Yeah. So let's get on with the business of it, shall we? Indigenous people are a political problem for settler societies, and Aboriginal people are a problem for Australians, and have been. Governments of all stripes have been concerned with defining and addressing the Aboriginal problem, whatever that might be, however it's articulated, almost since the beginning of colonisation. Conceptions of what exactly the problem might be have varied very widely, but the idea that the existence and practices of Aboriginal people constitute some sort of ongoing political issue to be addressed has persisted. This problematic status that's been consistently accorded to Indigenous people has been characterised by Indigenous scholars as an expression or feature of the colonial relationship, not necessarily as something that emanates from Indigenous people themselves. I'm going to skip through some of the foregrounding stuff. We can come back to it if any of this isn't clear, but one of the things that happens in a settler colonial context like Australia is that very important meanings of Australianness and Aboriginality exist in a fraught and unstable relationship to each other. As Aileen Morton Robinson explains, Australian national identity is predicated on retaining the benefits of colonial theft on one hand, while exalting a sense of tolerance and fair play on the other. Indigenous sovereignty continues through the presence of Indigenous peoples and their land, haunting the house that Jack built, shaking its foundations and rattling the picket fence. Settler constructions or ideas about who Aboriginal people are and what Aboriginality is continue to reflect a range of political aspirations of Australian nationhood, and they form what Cowlishaw has called a surface imagery that mirrors the nation's desires and fantasies. These problematisations of Aboriginality form part of an unremitting and solicitous national discourse about Aborigines, imbued with urgency and instrumentalism and replete with competing theories of cause and effect. Australia is particularly unique among former British colonies in the absence of treaties or other legitimising colonial instruments. What this means in our context here is that the problem of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, for settlers, has been particularly understood in our local context as an issue for governments to address through policy. Jeremy Beckett has commented on the way the state looms particularly large in the history of Australian Aborigines. The situation of Aborigines in relation to the state has become a problem in the sense of being something that requires the state to find a solution. For its part, the state is so inextricably bound up with Aborigines politically and administratively that it cannot easily disengage. Rather, each effort to solve the problem binds the two closer together. The implication of this is that the state is an integral part of the problem it is supposed to be solving. What this means, I guess, and there's two things that I think it means that shape the way I do my work. And these two things affect the way issues are framed here in ways that make Australia a particularly interesting case internationally when we're talking about settler colonialism and understanding colonialism in this place. The first one is that, on the one hand, there are remarkable similarities in many ways in the situations of Indigenous people in former British settler colonies, despite varying circumstances, timeframes and technologies of colonisation that have been adopted historically and in the contemporary context. But Australia's radical non-recognition of even the most limited forms of Indigenous sovereignty means that settler governments, courts and people here have asserted and assumed particular authority over Indigenous people in a much more direct and unmediated way than has happened in other contexts. Relatedly, there's an amplification of a much remarked upon settler colonial tendency to treat Indigenous people as a problem, to which settler institutions must be a solution. And you can see this even looking at, as an aside for an academic audience, if you have a quick look even at the comparison between the way we understand our research, our FOR codes. The one FOR code that we have in Australia, for field of research code that we have in Australia for assigning our research under that Maori don't have in New Zealand, they've got whole ranges of codes to do with living Maori law. In Australia we have one code that they don't, or two codes that they don't. One is Aboriginal information management, and the other is Aboriginal policy and administration. This is just not. This is inherent to the way we think about these issues in Australia, but it's weird internationally, I guess, is the point that I'm making. And I think we can learn really interesting things from looking at that. The second point that makes us really interesting internationally, and that I think we can learn interesting things from, is in terms of our racial dynamics. The particular way here that settler colonial binaries between Indigenous and non-Indigenous overlay the racial hierarchies in this place between black and white. What this means is that connections and interrelations between these systems are particularly marked and emphasised. The imbrication of race and colonialism is widely acknowledged historically, but in the present, fields of study that examine their operation tend to reify disciplinary or political separations that either allied race or fail to engage with Indigenous sovereignty. And this is particularly obvious in the American case, where critical race and whiteness studies, as it's emerged as a discipline coming out of American legal studies largely, often doesn't engage at all with questions of indigeneity and the way that Indigenous people are racialised. Thinking about race in the US context often doesn't involve thinking about indigeneity at all. And similarly, in critical Indigenous studies, often doesn't engage with race. And what that means is that a whole range of the ways that colonialism operates and that race operates as a global system get elided or missed. And I think there are some interesting opportunities in this place to look at these things. So I will spare you the really, really long self-serving justification on why I think it's useful to look at race. If anybody wants me to do that in more detail, I'm very happy to do that. But in very short terms, what I'm saying is that colonialism isn't the same as race, which isn't the same as nationhood or sovereignty. However, you can't understand any of these systems without understanding the others, the way they are part of the same systems, the way they operate together, and the different analytical purchases that literatures about these provide in order to give different insights. So there's an emerging kind of international debate about how to understand the situation of former British settler colonies. That's the language I use. Within settler colonialism, Patrick Wolf's last book, for example, the framing tends to be that race is an internal dynamic or a technology of colonialism, right? That race is a technology deployed to legitimise colonial projects. That's one way of thinking about the relationship between the two. Other ways of thinking about it would include the way that Aileen Morton Robinson talks about this, as though colonialism emanates from the possessive logic of patriarchal white sovereignty. So it's fundamentally racial in nature and is driven by a possessiveness that's inherent to whiteness and patriarchal whiteness particularly. Currently, the way I'm using these literatures is using them like lenses. I'm not staking out a particularly theoretically complex space in that terrain. What I'm just saying is I think you can overlay those different analytics and see different things through them. Anyway, so it's increasingly common in the sort of scholarship we do to look at policy and look at the way it problematises Indigenous people. That's happening increasingly in the public policy space in the wake of Foucauldian work and work by Carol Backey and others. And it's happening through increasingly critical scholarship in Indigenous studies. But I'm going to argue that I still think corresponding assumptions about the role of non-Indigenous people and institutions as the solutions to these problems are much less scrutinised. Even though to some extent they're implied, these implications are often not explored. I think we still tend to operate from the assumption that Indigenous policy is about Indigenous people or peoples, and that's what I'm contesting here today. The truth of a policy like the Northern Territory intervention is often assumed to be in the Northern Territory. And it's definitely true that that policy has a profound impact upon the lives and realities of Indigenous people subjected to it and made objects by it in a lot of ways. I'm certainly not denying that. But policies like the intervention also have an impact on Indigenous people in cities and other places. They do work constructing Indigenous identity, what we think of as authenticity, what we think of as legitimacy politically, who can speak and about what. But in a lot of other ways, the key targets of that policy weren't Indigenous people at all, but educated, reasonably liberal, middle-class, non-Indigenous people, mostly but not exclusively white people in Australian cities and suburbs. People very much like most of us in this room. So what I want to do is look at some of the investments and interests and aspirations for non-Indigenous people that are encoded in policy. And I think they're a lot more consistent than we often assume. There are lots of those you could use as your way in. Liz Strakosch and I have written together about the ways that policies construct a kind of vanishing endpoint of settler colonialism within them that combines colonial completion with a kind of progressive endpoint. That's one thing that's one way you can look at it. Other people look at a range of other ways in. What I'm looking at today is particularly the way that white virtue is secured and settler legitimacy maintained through a construct of colonising white innocence. I'll skip the literature review there, obviously, except to say that I'm mashing together some literatures that don't often speak between race and settler colonialism in ways that can, I think, be problematic, but can also be really useful. Just want to note a couple of things that, particularly Veracini's claim that settler colonial societies often operate through an aggressive drive to eradicate Indigenous people with a simultaneous disavowal of this foundational violence. And that I think plays into this construction of innocence that I'm talking about. A Canadian scholar called Shireen Razak has talked about white settler innocence, the notion that European settlers merely settled and developed the land. I'm using similar terminology but much more expansively. So I'm saying colonising white innocence is a construction of whites as non-problematic and not implicated in historical or contemporary violence. This construction preserves and sustains white virtue through legitimising and eliding white settler investments in maintaining power relationships generated by ongoing colonising racist violence. So it can be understood as simultaneously enabling and erasing colonial violence that's occurring in the present, circulating discursively, and it's one of many ways that settler legitimacy is asserted in our context through policy, which is where we get past this and into the stuff that might keep people awake. So, the Northern Territory intervention was announced in June 2007, as most of you will know, as the latest and arguably the most spectacular in a long Australian history of colonial child-saving projects. It operated through a set of authoritarian and paternalist policy measures imposed without consultation on Aboriginal people and communities. In 2007, the need to save the Aboriginal child was the primary basis on which this program was justified. Rebecca Stringer identifies a transactional politics operating by which the federal government extracts from disempowered children the power to act unilaterally upon and within their communities. The state was depicted as a heroic protector, and the morally charged tone of debates constructed opponents as politicised, complicit or morally deficient, allowing the Commonwealth and its agents to position themselves as acting for and alongside abused Aboriginal children. I've argued elsewhere that this manoeuvre was facilitated through the depiction of the state as unknowing, unaware of abuse that's been enabled and perpetuated through white Australian innocence and an Aboriginal silence. So in lots of the discourses about the intervention, abuse was constructed as recently revealed, occurring without the knowledge and thus without the participation of the state and its agents. There's lots of examples of this. Some are up on the screen. Mal Brough argued little children are sacred, made settlers aware of child abuse when it revealed a terrible situation. Similarly, Shadow Minister Jenny Macklin said horrific levels of child abuse that have now been made public really require urgent action. Howard argued that abuse was hidden from the public, in part by a permit system that kept communities out of view and out of mind. Now many Indigenous people are speaking out, and so we are determined to change course. What's notable in these quotes is that the public mind and the collective we that's referred to in this framing are viewers. They're distinct and separable from Indigenous people who are associated with those who are being viewed. Non-Indigenous Australians are innocent to abuse and only just now being made aware. Frequent comparisons between the emergency of child abuse and a natural disaster, a Hurricane Katrina, an earthquake, exacerbate this process. This construction relies on the erasure of several high-profile government reports and significant activism by Indigenous people and others stretching back well over a decade, the preceding decade leading up to this point, as Megan Davis has noted. It also erases the existing role claimed by the Australian state in servicing, regulating and policing Northern Territory Aboriginal communities, and it erases the significant presence of non-Indigenous people in those communities, often associated with perpetrating abuse. Nicole Watson and Larissa Berendt have argued that up to 50% of the perpetrators of abuse discussed in Little Children Are Sacred were spoken about as non-Indigenous people, but that wasn't a discussion that was possible to have in the discourse of the intervention because Aboriginality was associated so strongly with abuse. The unknowing settler state in this framing isn't and cannot be implicated in enabling, initiating or perpetuating abuse. This innocence both erases the state's implication in existing colonial relationships and morally authorises their continuation. In this case, arguably their escalation into a newly militarised and even more aggressively assimilationist form. This fundamental settler self-identification that I've just outlined remains strikingly similar, as did the policy measures themselves when the program morphed under subsequent ALP governments into an exercise in addressing disadvantage through closing the gap, and then into an agenda for broader cultural and economic integration through stronger futures. One of the startling things for me about the intervention as someone who studied its emergence and justification is how portable the legitimacy it gained through those discourses proved to be and has proven to be. Despite muddled and shifting policy objectives, extensive international and domestic criticism, scant evidence of outcomes, this paternalist approach continues with bipartisan support, even though many of the effects of the intervention have been devastating. I won't go into why this is so. There's a range of reasons I think this is so, lots of which revolve around the broad-based acceptance of authoritarian neoliberalism and public disinterest in Indigenous dissent. But one thing I think was a factor was that the underlying characterisations of the state and its agents remained fundamentally unchanged throughout these other discursive shifts. The image of an innocent, fundamentally benevolent and disinterested state intervening to manage a problematic Indigenous population and ensure the security of territory, despite a problematic history, resonates at a fundamental level with entrenched settler perceptions of ourselves and of our institutions. So these ideas about innocence are really striking when the state's in authoritarian mode, like it was in the intervention. I think you can see them too, and this is what I'm doing now, circulating as effectively in more recent technocratic or ostensibly inclusive articulations of policy. So the language of closing the gap is currently the hegemonic policy discourse adopted in Indigenous affairs. Although there's a related language of advancement and assistance that's also in ascendance. This language emerged from community campaigning that was focused on Indigenous health disparities in Indigenous health arising from state service delivery failures, and has been adopted by the Commonwealth and morphed into the Closing the Gap program, which seeks to align government stakeholders in order to measure progress in the pursuit of statistical equality for Indigenous Australians against a range of indicators, particularly to do with disadvantage, health and life expectancy. Liz Strackbush has talked about this as involving substituting a process of measurement for policy in a lot of ways. John Altman has commented that the creation and collection of data about Indigenous people and lives in this phase of policy is approaching almost manic levels. As Foley, Black and Richards note, performance measurement in Closing the Gap requires baseline data on what's wrong with Indigenous people. Deficit data then forms the basis of what is known about Indigenous people. This in turn sets the strategic goals for action to fix Indigenous people. Because the deficits are clearly situated within Indigenous Australians, progress is measured by the extent to which Indigenous Australians change for the better, thus insulating existing institutions, systems and power structures from an expectation to change. Annual speeches by Australian Prime Ministers on both sides of politics about the progress of closing the gap demonstrate how adeptly this rhetoric of technical policy solution can be turned into a discussion of Indigenous deficits and how those deficits can be deployed to legitimise settler sovereignty and futurity. We're going to do this historically, so go with me. We're going on a journey. So this is Rudd, the year after the apology. Actually, this is 2009. I've written 2008 on the slide. Rudd's quote here talks about a great wave of goodwill. His construction is of the state as agential. The state is driving this process, which requires Indigenous people to change. It requires the state to deliver different services in order to make this happen. We're addressing a problem of history. That problem of history is disadvantage, which is currently being transcended through technical capacity and white goodwill. While he talks about both Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians being eager to embrace a new approach, an evidence-based approach, an approach that transcends ideology, he talks about what is most needed to close the gap in each community and what works best to meet the need in each community. And the communities that must be acted upon are Indigenous communities and spaces. They're not settler institutions and practices necessarily, except insofar as those institutions and practices are insufficient to change behaviour in Indigenous communities. Generations of Indigenous disadvantage, Rudd cautions, cannot be turned around overnight. Under Gillard, this moves further. She's got a really interesting formulation at the top that I think is actually in another paper that Liz and I are writing. We're going to be talking a bit about this in relation to settler sovereignty. Australians want our Indigenous people to have a better life. I also understand many Australians wonder if our country can ever make that happen. I feel the force of these two Australian emotions, our deep dream of a better life for all and our deep fear that we can never truly achieve it. She transitions next in what follows. Closing the gap is about saying Indigenous people can expect basic citizenship entitlements from government like any other people, like any other citizens, and then into a monologue about that Indigenous people should expect of themselves the same things that all Australians expect as well. With opportunity comes responsibility, progress through work and effort, and then a long list of prescriptions of what Indigenous people are required to demonstrate under these new arrangements. Respecting good social norms, respecting the law, down to reaching out to other Australians. So there's a very clear logic of one Australianness here, in which Indigenous people are expected to become Indigenous Australians and accommodate themselves to this. You move on. If we move on then into Abbott, what he does is amplify this focus on Indigenous people's lives and on changing Indigenous people's lives. These reports should be less about what government is doing and more about how people are living. We will know that Aboriginal people are living better when children go to school, when adults go to work and the ordinary law of the land is respected and enforced. These aspirations come from a particular settler paradigm. There's been no conversations, I'm assuming, that I can find anywhere about how we will know when Indigenous people are living better, except when they are living more like non-Indigenous people. But the one thing he is confident of is that amidst all the mistakes and disappointments and uncertain starts, which is what the state is charged with, which is a pretty light way of referring to 200 years of colonial violence, mistakes, disappointments and uncertain starts, the one failure we have mostly avoided is a lack of goodwill. So that's nice for us all, isn't it? Sorry, I'll stop being so sarcastic. The next point is moving on to Turnbull, which is where we are now, which is where he notes, I think quite honestly, when we close the gap, we make ourselves more whole, more complete, more Australian. And I think that's actually what this project is about. Settler health and lifestyle indicators in all of the quotes I've just read are framed as neutral. Indigenous people are depicted as deficient, unruly, ungrateful or unhealthy subjects of white benevolence. The impacts of colonialism and of institutional racism in shaping health outcomes among Indigenous peoples are very widely acknowledged domestically and internationally. But these outcomes in this context are transformed into an argument for an escalation of assimilation and the desirability of white settler futures. So this policy too relies on an erasure of the state's partiality and implication in the problems it is addressing. Colonising white innocence allows the state to be configured as fundamentally not implicated in the lives and health of Indigenous peoples it has claimed to govern for as long as it has existed. A racially and politically neutral collector of measurements of black deficit, as well as the legitimate and overarching mechanism through which this problematic and unhealthy deficit can be managed and resolved. Moving on from that, the Recognise campaign is my third policy case study. It's framed in a much more liberal and inclusive mode. It's unusual, I think, to consider a campaign like Recognise as a policy framework. I think it's defensible for a number of reasons that I'm not going to bore you with, but largely because they're government funded through Reconciliation Australia to deliver a range of outcomes that government has said that they are keen to seek. So in that respect, they're as much a policy instrument as the Cape York Institute or the University of Queensland. Recognise are charged with building public support for constitutional amendments, changing or deleting racially specific powers allocated to the Commonwealth in the Australian Constitution, and inserting sections acknowledging Aboriginal peoples and potentially languages. This is described as having both symbolic benefits and a material impact on and for Indigenous peoples. More broadly, Recognise, as you can see from the quote I've put up here, adopts a discourse of slow national progress towards a racially non-discriminatory future. I won't read it all out to you. Underpinning this agenda is a desire to separate a virtuous and presumably racially non-discriminatory present and future from a problematic colonial past. And political support for recognition has been explicit on this point, as you can see in Tony Abbott's comment up here. What's sought in this manoeuvre is a move from complicity with a colonial past to a more neutral constitution, in keeping with the needs of an innocent present. And as such, a constitution which has the capacity to transcend the categories of race and coloniality that shaped its framing. So what's not subject to debate is the capacity of this constitution to become neutral, to transcend the fundamental political philosophies and relationships upon which it is based. Similarly, not subject to debate is the fundamental innocence and virtue, legitimacy, etc., of current institutional and political arrangements, even though they derive from this problematic constitution and founding. So, racism and colonialism in the framing of the Australian state, in this construction, are a diseased limb that can be amputated, rather than an illness to an entire body. Or, and this is where my metaphor collapses fairly spectacularly, a collection of peoples and systems in conflict being marshalled violently into bodiness, when the appearance as a body is in the political interests of one party to that conflict. In this construction, the racist past is problematic because of non-recognition or exclusion from Australia, not because of colonial theft or because of forcible inclusion within Australia. The alternatives available to Indigenous peoples are constructed as a continued state of racist non-recognition and exclusion, or inclusion within white settler structures that deny their whiteness and their continuing coloniality. Formally recognising Indigenous peoples at the same moment they are declared properties or precursors of a settler nation into which they have been successfully incorporated. Possibilities for decolonisation or for restitution are discursively foreclosed, although I will note here that despite the strength of my critique there, Indigenous peoples have proven to be very creative and persistent in refusing to be foreclosed and in maintaining and being strategic in engaging with the state in a range of different ways. Central to each of these policy manoeuvres, as I hope I've made clear, is a constructed and colonising white innocence. In each example, it operates to perpetuate the colonial project while declaring it finished, and at the same time to insist upon the fundamental benevolence and neutrality of contemporary colonisers and our institutions. White settler investments in maintaining power relationships and hierarchies generated by ongoing colonising violence are obscured and reinforced. In each of the policy approaches I've discussed, the proffered resolution to the problem and problems of Indigenous people operate as a theatre of legitimacy for the state, affirming the inherent sovereignty and fundamental authority of the settler state and its agents. I'm still developing this work, so I won't go on at length, you'll be pleased to hear, but I do want to talk about some of the implications of this analysis. And the first is that while not every policy is necessarily engaged in colonising white innocence, policies that present or are presented as neutral or benevolent are almost axiomatically doing some kind of colonising work. This isn't saying that all colonising policies are morally, materially or politically equivalent. Differences in policy approaches have really significant and substantial consequences, particularly for those Indigenous people who are its objects and whose lives are made the subjects of state policy. The insights I'm trying to provide aren't attempting to substitute for an appreciation of how policy is experienced or for an evaluation of these policies in traditional terms. I'm not arguing that differences in settler colonial policy approaches don't matter, just that it's also really important to understand the similarities that are in play. Differences in policy articulation or effects are not the same as settler benevolence, and we shouldn't pretend that these measures exhaust the available political possibilities, even if that might be convenient for those of us who benefit from ongoing colonial domination. The state has been and continues to be part of and party to racialised colonial conflict. Colonising white innocence allows our contemporary institutions to deny this fact, to continue generating authoritative problematisations of Indigenous others, and to present continued domination as a necessary or benevolent solution. Policy in general tends to operate through narratives that cast the state and its agents as heroic protagonists. But colonising white innocence additionally imbues the state with the capacity to transcend its location in whiteness and coloniality by erasing the contribution of the past and continuing practices to contemporary policy problems. Or in authorising the state's claim to be or to become a neutral and benign arbiter, further reinforcing white settler narratives about the capacity of our liberal institutions to resolve colonialism and Indigenous difference. These discourses exemplify the ways that Indigenous policy performed through white settler innocence evidences Woolf's logic of elimination. It simultaneously contributes to the elimination of Indigenous claims to independent political life outside of settler structures and legitimises this replacement. While it may be possible for white settler institutions to engage with Indigenous peoples in ways that don't problematise and don't seek to coerce or eliminate, these engagements can't occur while colonising white innocence allows the state to continue maintaining its basic benevolence, its basic neutrality and its basic transcendent qualities, and ultimately its authority over Aboriginal peoples. When the relationship of Indigenous people to the state is located in questions of policy and not in a history of military encounters or nation-to-nation sovereign pacts or other law-establishing mechanisms, a number of things happen politically, and one of those is that the relationship enacted between settler and Indigenous peoples through and by the state, its institutions and agents in and as policy, becomes a crucial site of sovereign legitimacy. It's where settlers demonstrate both their replacement of Indigenous people as the authority over this land or territory, as well as where we assert the fundamental legitimacy of that replacement. So colonising white innocence, I think, and this is the last thing I'll say because you're probably getting a bit bored of hearing me at this point. Colonising white innocence is redemptive in this respect. It's offering resolution to settlers to the ongoing issue or challenge of Aboriginality. The colonial relationship is situated solidly in the past. Current generations of white Australians are understood as finally dealing with an uncomfortable anomaly or a legacy of which we are innocent inheritors, rather than as perpetrators of ongoing colonial violence. Rejection of Indigenous sovereignty can thus be framed as a gesture of redemption and inclusion. While the nation-state remains strongly situated as a settler enterprise, space can be provided in order to extend the protection of the state to Indigenous predecessors. And I don't think that that's necessarily inevitable or that it's necessarily sufficient. And that's where I stop.